We have talked so much about money and dating and relationships, and I have had situations I've talked about, Caitlyn, while dating where I felt like I've ended up paying way more of the tab, and in some cases all of the tab. If you've listened to several of our episodes, I've talked about the $1,000 fly fishing date that I ended up paying for. So today we're going to talk about financial issues and relationships. I think it's a very important topic, and you and I are probably going to come at this from two different perspectives, like we do on so many of the issues, because I am inching towards 60. I'll be 58 in 2025, and you are almost 30.
Yes, and I do feel like I have seen finances be a kind of a power struggle in relationships. I have never dealt with it myself, but I think that there are different ways to handle it and move forward, and you probably have a lot more experience with it.
Well, and sometimes I don't know what the red flags are because I tend to wear rose-colored glasses, especially at the beginning of a relationship, and then I see them after the fact. So we thought we'd bring on Heather Kelly. She's one of our colleagues at KSL Newsradio in Salt Lake City, and you also host a podcast. You've been a longtime host of the podcast Money Making Sense, and you recently dropped an episode about finances and financial abuse in relationships.
Yes. And I think, again, with you, it's a very, very important subject, and one that I think a lot of people are aware of some of the red flags if there's physical or mental abuse in a relationship, but financial abuse often is combined with both physical and mental abuse.
But sometimes it can be separate too.
It can be, yes.
So why don't we start by laying the groundwork here? What are we talking about when you say, there's financial abuse in a relationship? Give us some ideas.
Some of it, especially once you're in a marriage, it's a little easier for the control to happen where one spouse or the other, or even if you're not married, you're just living together, they take control of the banking. You're not allowed your own allowance, or you're not allowed to get your own money necessarily. Your significant other is the one handing over, like, here's your allowance for the week. You make it stretch. Do whatever you want. Your significant other can take out credit in your name, and you may not even know about it because you're not allowed to see the bills or, pay them. You are starting to get isolated from where are our finances. Maybe you're not even sure what bank you're at. You have no idea what your credit rating is because you never are allowed, or, they've asked you, no, you don't need to worry about that. I'm taking care of all that. You do other stuff. And it can seem like it's an act of love. Like, oh, I know you don't really like dealing with the money. It's okay. I will take care of all that. But then it becomes isolating. Then you're not allowed to go to the bank. You're not allowed to withdraw your own money. You don't realize that your credit rating is going down the drains because they're taking out all these extra credit cards, running up the bills, not paying them back. And then it's too late by the time you realize it.
At what point would you consider, or I'm not sure if you asked this question on your podcast, would it be considered financial abuse per se versus someone just wanting to be the one who manages that, I guess? Right. I guess there's a conversation that needs to be had, but what would you say to that?
There's nothing wrong with just one person taking care of the bills. There's not. But you should also be having a conversation with your significant other at least once a month. Like, hey, guess what? This is how much all the bills were this month. We put out, XYZ amount of money, and we only brought in this amount. Ooh, things are a little tight. And by the way, just want to remind you, this is where I have our 401k or the IRA. I want to do an investment over here. What do you think? You need to be included in all those conversations, whether you actually deal with the banks yourself, you're writing the checks or the bills, but where everything is going.
So a red flag would be they don't ever want to have that once a month sit down meeting. Which does not sound like a lot of fun, but it is necessary.
It is totally necessary. And if they do the let me take care of it. Don't worry about it. And you start asking questions later on. Maybe it's a few years. Maybe you're young when you get married and you don't think anything about it. And then you get a little experience under your belt. You start going, hey, I keep hearing on the news or I read articles. I should know where my money's going. And you ask the significant other and they're like, they get angry about it. They get defensive. They don't want to show you any of those things. That is a huge red flag.
So, Heather, when somebody reports physical abuse to police, we've got some data on that. Not that everybody always reports when they're abused to police, but at least we have some data. Do we have any data on how frequently financial abuse happens in relationships?
We don't. It's not tracked that much because a lot of times the bank accounts are maybe in only one person's name, especially if you have a spouse or a significant other who is extremely controlling and won't even allow their spouse to have their own bank account. So sometimes they don't even have their name on a savings account or anything like that. So it's much harder to track that. And people are very, as much as ashamed they are of admitting that they've been hit or, there's violence, there's even more shame around, I have no money. I can't leave. Like the isolation that you get with somebody who's controlling the money is to such a point that the person who's being abused is like, I can't even leave because I won't have any money. I don't know how to open a bank account. I don't know how to open a credit card. They can't even rent an apartment sometimes because their credit has been destroyed to such a point that most people who rent homes or apartments, they run a credit check. And that's sometimes the first time they're thinking about leaving. So they go to a landlord and they go, okay, fill out an application. I've got to run a credit check. And then they go, I'm sorry, I can't rent to you because your credit score is 400.
If you're someone who's experiencing this isolation and maybe you are thinking about leaving, but you're kind of feeling lost, what kind of steps could that person take to start the process of becoming more financially independent?
The first thing, so on the episode that you talked about, Debbie, that just aired, I was talking to Kim Schooler. She's a financial educator, and she is also the author of How Money Works for Women. And the first thing that she says is if you are ready to go, you need to start making steps. And one of them is just pocket as much money away as you can. Even if it's only $1 a week, you start squirreling that somewhere where the significant other isn't going to find it, because you do need to have a little bit of money to just get out to, maybe it's to get the Uber, to leave the house, but that's the first step. Squirrel away a little bit of money. Try to do research if you can. Where is it you can go? Look for the shelters for women that you can go to, because they will have a lot of resources and they are there to help you get back on your feet financially as well.
As a woman who's dating, Caitlyn's dating
Right.
too, what would you suggest as somebody that talks about money a lot on her podcast? What are some of the red flags that you would suggest we be looking for to stay away from this kind of a relationship?
I would say the person who may be too generous at first, sort of that love bombing type thing where they are trying to portray that I love you so much, but it's all too much too fast. Like you've had 2 dates and then all of a sudden they're like, let's get serious. They're sending you flowers. They're sending you chocolates. They're taking you on these wild dates that just seem like
Over the top.
Yeah. They are trying to get their hooks in you really fast for some reason. Now, it may not be because it's financial abuse, but there is something going on that they think that they need to glom onto you right now.
You just explained love bombing very well.
Which could lead to all kinds of negative behaviors in a relationship.
That is the biggest. I think love bombing within probably 2 months of date. If any of this love bombing goes on within the first 2 months, I'm not even talking 2 days, like 2 months in my book, it's like, whoa,
I'm going to add this just based on my experience in dating. I do feel, and I've talked about this openly on the podcast, but also on my social media on my TikTok page about when you go on dates, when I've gone on dates with men and I consistently get stuck with the tab. And we're not talking, a dinner date. Of course, I want to, carry my fair share in these situations. But when it becomes obvious that I feel financially taken advantage of. Right. That to me also feels like that's a red flag, and it's taken me a long time sometimes in a dating relationship to see this as a red flag, to where I'm paying for things that I probably shouldn't be paying for, whether that's not only for road trips and vacations. It should be split. I'm paying most of the bill. Paying for getaways to get out of the town. It costs $1,000. On and on and on. And that to me that's probably not considered financial abuse. Well, but I feel taken advantage of. Let me just put it that way.
Right. Well, it can be a form of financial abuse if you've got the person who is thinking, here's my meal ticket. So they're abusing your amount of money you can bring in that's going to benefit them, but they're not bringing anything else to the table.
They're not. Yeah, I'm talking about situations where it's never 50-50, it's
right.
Like, I worry too that we so often talk about this in the form of women being affected by it, but I do hear from men who feel the same way when they're trying to date women.
Yeah. For me, I look at it more proportionally. So if I am dating somebody who is pretty close to my salary, within 10, 20,000, per year, like we're fairly evenly matched. Yeah, do the 50-50 or, first dinner, maybe he pays, but the second dinner I pay. Like, at least you're working it out fairly equitable. But if you are in a relationship with somebody who has a lot more money than you do, then I feel it should be proportional. Okay, if I make, $10,000 a year and they make $100,000 a year, I'm only going to pay 10% and they can pay the other 90% because that's all I can afford.
You might not know that right away, though. Yeah, with their salaries.
Right. Exactly. Now, that's not going. Should not hopefully come up in the first date, or that's another big red flag.
Yeah. I think it all just comes down to having that conversation once you're at that point of dating. It's not the first thing that you necessarily would be. And as far as you say with you being the one taken advantage of, I think it happens obviously on both sides. Sometimes it takes another person's view to let you know that you're even doing that, because sometimes we just think we're being helpful when we're really being taken advantage of.
Heather, speak to that. I think Caitlyn brings up an excellent point, is that sometimes we have to ask, we should ask a friend or a family member, like, is this normal?
Yeah.
Because too often we wear these rose-colored glasses or make excuses.
Especially if for Caitlyn, since you're younger, you haven't been experienced a lot of dating.
No, I haven't. You're fine to say that.
So you haven't experienced a lot of these situations. So going to someone who just has a little bit more life experience behind them to get the view, that is great. But that also brings up another red flag, is if any type of abuse, whether it's financial or not, will try to isolate you. So if you do go speak to your family members and you say, hey, I'm concerned about this. They go, oh, no, that isn't it. Go talk to them and ask them what they think about if we do it this way. And you do that and they get defensive and they say, your family member just doesn't love me and they're trying to keep us apart. And any type of thing, they are trying to convince you that a wedge is trying to be put between the two of you as a love interest. That's a red flag.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the issue too is that when they're gaslighting you. I mean, that's exactly that they're gaslighting you. But the issue is oftentimes, and I've done this, I'm guilty of it, and I know I've had friends that do it too. We keep going back thinking things will change. But I'm sure in your experience, Heather, talking to people about money and hosting the Money Making Sense podcast, you find that people kind of at a certain age, they don't really change their money habits.
No, not too much. It can be done, but there's always that default mode. So if they get stressed, if things get tight, they're trying to change. They may be, okay, I really want to change my behaviors, and they're doing a fairly good job, but then something happens, like, the stock market's down, or we have a recession or whatever, and anxiety builds up. They go back to that default mode because they feel safe there. Even if it's not a comfortable place to be, that's what they've known. That's what they grew up with. That's their behavior for most of their life. And even if they're trying to change it, it's still a place of safety.
I think another issue, I don't know if it's a form of abuse or anything, but just something that is causing financial strain in relationships. As you talk about money so often, how in your own life would you bring up a difficult conversation about finances in any sense, really?
Well, the best story I can give is, my husband wanted a boat. We talked about it. I'm like, and I'm the saver. I'm like, we are not spending a dime more than we have to anywhere. And one day, my husband, I come home and there is a brand new boat in our driveway. And, it was like $50,000. And I'm like, what? And all I could see was the 401k was gone. Like, I had no savings. Like, what am I going to live on? If I lose my job, whatever. Turns out, when he was growing up, his best memories were when, as a child, he would go out with his dad, with his parents and the siblings. And to him, those trips on the boat, just going out to a lake, that was love. Like, he felt love there. Mm-hmm. And his intention wasn't to spend all our money, even though that's what he did. It was trying to create what he had in childhood. But we'd never talked about, that's what the boat meant to him. Yeah. The boat was love. It went back. I was just saying.
To the dealership, not to the lake?
Yeah, exactly. But that's when you can then go, okay, let's rent a boat on those occasions. You don't have to buy one. That's just what he knew growing up. So you have to have the conversations, and you have to figure out, what does money mean to the person, or what people can buy with the money mean to that person? Because once you get down to the feeling that's around the object or the money, that's when the conversations really are meaningful, and you can start to work on, okay, I might be able to meet you halfway.
Yeah, you came to a compromise there, and I think that's very telling with all this.
What I worry about with Caitlyn,
listen, the reason I said the bird's eye view thing is because she's done that to me, and I've been like, yeah, you're right. We need to change something.
But I worry about with Caitlyn is, being almost 30, not quite, is that she's got first of all, she's a super hard worker. We know that from working with her at KSL Newsradio. She's also conscientious with her money. Mostly.
Depends on the day.
You are very,
I go through phases, but I try to be.
I'm really impressed with you. And she's established in her career. Now, what I worry about is somebody who's significantly older than her, looking at, knowing her situation so well, because we do this podcast and we work together. I worry about somebody taking advantage of her, if you will. And so we've talked about that a lot on this podcast, about how do you get somebody in your life who is on that same platform or plane as you are when you're almost 30 years old, but you have a lot of runway, a lot of life left, and you want to make sure they have the same similar spending habits. They have the same credit card use habits. They have the same feeling of obligation when it comes to paying off debt.
Right.
And I worry about that because, well, she's a good friend and she's an awesome coworker, but there's a lot of parents. I worry about that for my own kids too, and they're in their 20s.
Yeah.
So what do you suggest for them?
If you're at that point where you're ready to be serious, even if it's not marriage, but maybe you're looking at moving in together or you've become exclusive, still do not share your Social Security number with them for any reason whatsoever. That should only be done after marriage, because there are certain things you have to have together, like filing taxes or whatever.
So the Social Security number, don't share it because it goes back to that our original conversation of financial abuse. You don't know them well enough to know that they won't be taking out credit cards or payday loans using your information.
Even if you're exclusive, if you think do not give them Social Security number, don't give them, your credit cards. You can watch their behavior on their own credit card receipt if they allow you to. But I would not get like a joint credit card either, because once your name is on that, and if they are the big spender and then you struggle to pay that off, your credit goes down along with theirs. Mm-hmm. If you are married, if you're newlywed, everybody's, we got to put all our finances together in a bank. And that is fine. And I'm not saying keep everything separate. But what you want to do is have like one account where, 40% of each or 50% of each of your paychecks go into the one kitty. Then you keep 50% of your paycheck, they keep 50% of theirs. And you both have to agree ahead of time that, hey, if, as long as we're not struggling and we can pay everything out of their kitty, out of the joint account, if you can, whatever you need to buy, great. Pay off your credit cards. You do that in that separate account. And you do the same for yourself in your separate account. But you have to agree, like, okay, this joint one, we're paying the mortgage, we're paying the car payments, we're the kids' school, or, whatever it is. But you have your own account, and you should not feel guilty about using it. And if you want to use it for your 401k, because that's what I do, that's what you do. The husband if they can, if he could afford a boat with his portion, but he couldn't. If he could afford a boat with just his portion of his little thing that doesn't affect me, hey, I'm not gonna guilt him for it.
I like that because everybody handles their money differently, but I've always struggled with the idea of sharing mine.
Right.
So, but I like the way that you just kind of set that up, as we have the one bucket and then we have our own independence on this side, because that gives me a peace of mind if I were to get into that situation.
And I grew up in the generation where you just put everything in the same bank account. Everything was joint. And then once you got married, and then you just went on from there, and one person was in charge of paying the bills and the other person was in charge of, whatever, however that looked. But we did, a joint account. But this idea that things have changed, in terms of how we view accounts now I think that's good information, Heather.
Yeah. And don't give the other person your separate account number, even if you're married. Now, at some point you may have to, if you trust them years down the road and you realize, I'm not being financially taken advantage of. But they could, if there is financial abuse going on, if you have the joint account and then you each have separate ones, they could just and then you give him your separate account number. He could very easily just transfer money out of there and
Well, I think this could go both ways, right?
Yeah.
Not that you're that person, but it could go both ways.
It could, yeah. He could take it out of the joint account and put it into separate, or you could do the same thing if you wanted to be the financial abuser.
Yeah. I even think with credit cards, it makes me question, I would maybe have my own credit cards, but should you share a credit card account? Because what if I guess it's their problem if it's just their credit card and they're spending like crazy on the credit card.
Yes.
But yeah, I'm just thinking about all the things that not having access to people's accounts could cause. So,
yeah, I mean, I would never have a joint credit card with somebody. It's the bank account. There is still that little bit of trust, and I feel sometimes uneasy about it. But we also have set up that this is for the mortgage, this is for the car payment, and we all know how much that is going to be, and we both have access to look at the balance of that joint account. Mm-hmm. So if things are amiss in there, we're having a conversation.
Right. Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah. Well, and as I go forward and continue not to meet any men to date, I like this idea too, because I've been a little, I've just contemplated, how does that look down the road for me if I do meet somebody and we decide to, either move in together or get married down the road? How does that look financially? So what I worry about is my runway to retirement is much shorter than Caitlyn's. I don't have an opportunity to financially recover where I have 30 years left of my career. So the idea of putting it all in the same, you call it the kitty. I like that. Yeah. In the same pool. And then that's where the major bills get paid out of, what would be, I guess, a house payment or utilities or an HOA payment. And then separate accounts for whatever our individual expenses are.
Now, I do have a friend who she's on her third marriage, but she's been married now for 12 years on this third marriage.
That's awesome.
But this time around, they did not do a joint account at all.
Okay.
But they have agreed he pays for the mortgage and she pays the car payments. And, there's other bills in there as well. But they've worked out what ones are going to be paid for. Now, he makes a fair amount more money than she does. So that's why he got the mortgage. So, but when you run all the bills down together, he's paying about 65% of the bills and she's paying 35% because she makes, just that little bit less than he does.
So I'm hearing there's got to be a conversation and a lot of transparency. And if you are in a relationship where there's zero transparency and one person is making all of the decisions financially, red flag.
Yeah,
red
totally.
Flag, red flag.
Yeah. And see, for me, that conversation where if somebody came to me and said, "Oh, you've worked so hard all your life," like I can see this happening to you, Caitlyn. You've worked so hard for years, and you're doing so well. Let me take care of this. I don't want you to stress about the money anymore. I'm making so much, and you can still keep your job. That's great, but just let me worry about it.
I would be like, okay, maybe for like a couple months because I do need a little bit of a break. But yeah, the control is something to be aware of.
Yeah, it's like, no, nobody is controlling. Like, I am not turning over the control of my paycheck, fully my paycheck to anybody for any reason whatsoever.
Yeah, no, I totally get that.
Do you just want to, reiterate somebody, if you're married long enough and they are opening up a credit card in your name, and the only way to do that is if they have your social security number. And then there's typically other forms of abuse in a financial abuse relationship. If you finally do decide to leave, you have to understand how much having a low credit score will affect you. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't leave. You still need to leave if you're in any type of abuse whatsoever. But you've got to be prepared for that. And there are resources out there. Look to your local governments, to shelters. They all have different, depending on where you live, will have access to organizations that can help get you on your feet and help prepare your credit.
So, Heather, let's talk about some of the issues that might arise. And as you said, I want to reiterate that. This you should get out, right? But what you're saying is be aware, be prepared that your credit score, if you've been in a financial abuse situation, will probably have taken a huge hit.
Yeah.
So what are some of the hurdles that could be presented besides we talked about, maybe not being able to get a place to rent?
Yeah. A lot of employers are also pulling credit. They think how good of an employee you are is based on how well you can pay your bills. So sometimes not even be able to find a good paying job can be a hurdle.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was something they did. Interesting.
I know this was happening a lot between about 2010 and 2016. It was huge. It was big. I'm not sure it's happening as much anymore, but there are certainly employers out there that are still pulling credit.
Well, particularly if you're going into employment, this is just from my experience, that has to do with some sort of like financial institution or something of that nature. Maybe you're going to be working with law enforcement on certain things that they want to know, like how financially responsible at least you look on paper with your credit. So that's an interesting thing that I think a lot of people wouldn't realize.
Yeah, even in the broadcasting industry, because I was in the middle of switching companies in 2012 when this was happening. And guess what? My credit kept getting pulled from broadcast companies.
Oh, okay.
I'm like,
interesting.
I'm going to be sitting behind a microphone. Like, really?
But they want to know what your credit worthiness is.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that it might not be so hard to get a credit card because credit cards are sometimes issued for a variety of reasons.
Right.
However, your credit card interest rate might be extremely high.
So my interest, for anybody who cares, my credit rating right now is 820. And the highest you can get is 850. So the interest rate on my credit card is at 15%. But somebody who's at 700, which is still a really good credit rating, they're going to pay 20 to 22%. And if you've really been dropped down because of financial abuse or any other reason, and you're down in the 500 or 400 mark, your interest rate is going to be 35-40%.
I want to give some hope here because I was the victim. I found out one day after our Dave and Dujanovic show on KSL News Radio, I'd walked out of the studio. And I'd been getting a series of odd text messages, but I ignored them because they seemed fishy and scammy. And I got a phone call. And because I'm a journalist, I pick up phone calls from unrecognizable numbers quite frequently because sometimes it can be somebody out of the blue just calling me with the story idea or whatever, somebody calling me back who wants to be on the air. So I picked up the phone and it was a debt collector. And it turned out I was the victim of identity theft. Through thick and thin, somebody or some scammers had been going around the country and online taking out payday loans in my name for very low amounts. They had all of my personal information, my personally identifiable information that they could do this online. They didn't actually go in person. This is something new I learned about that aspect of identity theft. And they had been successful in some cases. In other cases, they'd hit a brick wall and weren't able to get those payday loans. I think they also tried to rent like an appliance in my name, a television or something like that. Basically, my identity was being used illegally all across the country to try to, take out credit. They were, to some extent, successful. Of course, they took it out. It was dumped into a bank account. That bank account was drained. They drained the bank account, and then they'd closed the account. Well, they didn't ever pay back the loans. So the debt collectors were calling me because my name was on file. Well, what happens when you don't pay back your debt, your loans, any sort of credit that's taken out in your name? You just take the money and you run with it. Well, your credit score drops. But except for me, I wasn't the one doing the stealing. A scammer was. But my credit score got dinged big time. Yeah. And it went from the 800s down to I think it was the high 6s at some point. Well, case in point, something I learned, this is a huge red flag for identity theft. If this happens to you too, you might want to think but what I want to say here is if you are a victim of financial abuse and this happens to your credit score and you're struggling, there is hope because it did not take me very long to get my credit score going up and up and up again, because I just followed some simple principles of, and you can go to, somebody who knows a lot more about this than I do, like you, Heather. You can listen to your podcasts and that kind of thing, or go to an expert or ask your bank, what are ways that I can get my credit score back up? My credit score was vastly improved by late 2021. Early, maybe even earlier than that. So, and I found out in mid to late 2020 that this happened. So in less than a year, I had turned it around. I know that seems like a long time, but it was crawling up because it did hurt my credit score. And it didn't just something that I could just say, hey, it's not my fault. Somebody was stolen my identity. I had to work at bringing my credit score back up. So if you're a financial abuse victim, there's a lot of hope and a lot of things that you can do to quickly remedy this. There
is. One of the quickest ways I know is if you get a gas card. And I know a lot of credit cards, you can use them to pay with your gas, but get specifically only to purchase gas. And if you fill up your car, $30-$40 3 times a month, pay that off immediately. You have to make sure that you pay off that entire balance that month. Do not let that balance turn over. And even doing that for a year, just, $80 on one card, that's it. That's the only card, if you're trying to repair your credit, you should have in your possession. You pay cash for everything else for the time being. And just have this one card that's the only thing you pay, and make sure you only put enough on it that you can pay off it every single month. You'll get, that will bring you up very quickly.
That's really good to know. I don't think people even know that you can get a gas card.
I had one for years.
Yeah.
That's all I had for years back in my 20s. I don't have one anymore, but that's a great tip, Heather. And I think it's hopeful
Yeah,
to
definitely.
people. Well, Heather, you're awesome.
Thank you.
So great to talk to you and bring your tips on how to deal with, financial issues and financial abuse in relationships.
Thank you so much. I just hope everybody, they need to learn the red flags. That's the big thing, because we can all say, oh, don't get into abusive relationship. But if you don't know what the flags are of an abusive relationship, it's hard to avoid that sometimes.
And it's also important to ask other people's opinions or listen to them when they're trying to tell you. Because it's really easy to keep those rose-colored glasses on. We've all done it.
Heather Kelly, Money Making Sense host of the podcast. You can find it wherever you get your podcast. It's a KSL podcast. And thank you so much, Heather.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Dating at Her Age. We will not have an episode next week due to the holidays, so we want to wish you a happy holiday. Remember to romanticize your life during Christmas, and it's okay to feel a little lonely, but you are in control. So go take yourself to that movie. Plan a night in, create a nice little date for yourself, and it will all be okay. If you want to leave us a comment or a voicemail, give us a call at 801-575-5599 or email us daha@ksl.com. See you in January.